Good morning and welcome to Bible Truth for Kids. Today we're looking at two letters to two more cities, the cities of Pergamum and Thyatira, and these letters are from Jesus. But first of all, I have a question to ask you. Do you like receiving feedback? You know, feedback means that someone tells us how we did on a performance or a project. And sometimes we get nervous about that because we all want to be told that we did a terrific job. Well, Jesus gave feedback to two churches last week, the church in Ephesus and the church in Smyrna. To the church in Ephesus, he said, you're doing all the right things, but you don't love me the way that you used to. Jesus places loving him as being the most important thing. And to the church at Smyrna, well, he didn't have anything bad to say about them, only good. You know, they were being persecuted for their faith, but they were remaining faithful to Jesus, and he promised them that they would receive the crown of life if they remained faithful. Well, today it's Pergamum and Thyatira. So Pergamum is way up here. It's about 105 kilometers from Smyrna. And Pergamum was a wealthy city, and it boasted a library of over 200,000 volumes. Now that is a lot, because you know, the city that I live in, the central library boasts 450,000. So really, when you think about it, Pergamum had a very extensive and impressive library. But you know, their books didn't look like our books because they didn't have paper like we have paper. So they had to write on parchment paper. So parchment was actually a very expensive sheepskin that was stretched out like this on a frame until it became very tight and thin and dry. And so they could write on it, and that was their paper. And it kind of turned out something like this. You can see how thin it is, but that's how they wrote their books. You know, the word parchment comes from the word Pergamum. Now, Pergamum was also a big center for medicine, and they worshipped the god of medicine called Asclepius. So the believers were surrounded by a lot of idol worship and a lot of emperor worship. And when Jesus started out his letter to the church at Pergamum, he said, I am the one that holds the double-edged sword. The double-edged sword is the word of God. You know, those believers, even though they were surrounded by the idol worship and the emperors, they were remaining faithful. But Jesus said, I have some things against you, because some of the believers, they thought that it is okay to attend the feasts of false gods and you know, offer meat to them, different things like that. And then you could just, you know, go to the church in Pergamum and worship Jesus. Some of them even thought, you know, you can participate in doing some wicked things and then just still go and worship Jesus. You can mix sinful things with the true worship. Jesus said, no, you cannot, and you must put those things right. You know, the leaders in the church, they knew what some of these believers were doing, but they didn't do anything about it. Jesus said, you've got to turn away from it. If you do, he said, I will give you a white stone with a new name on it. A white stone, like, what would that mean? Well, you know, the Romans, they used to give out white stones in their athletic events to the winners. The winners got their name on a white stone, and then that served as a ticket to go to an awards banquet afterwards. So we can see that as a picture of Jesus saying to us, it's an invitation to a celebration in heaven if you turn away from these things that are wrong. You know, we have the same choice as those believers in Pergamum did too. We should choose not to mix sinful things with true worship. They do not go together. All right, Thyatira. Well, Thyatira was about 56 kilometers from Pergamum. It was not a great city. It's a small city, actually. But, you know, they got the longest letter of the 7 churches. And, you know, the letter to Thyatira, it was a serious one. It started out like this. Jesus said, the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like polished bronze. That's a picture of judgment. This is a serious letter. He had a lot to say to them. But first he said, I know your works, I know your love, your service, your patience, but I've got some things against you. Well, what could they be? Well, first of all, let's talk about Thyatira. What kind of a city was it? Well, it was small, but they were famous for wool and for textiles, like cloth like that. I mean, there's a woman from Thyatira called Lydia. We learn about her in the book of Acts, and the Apostle Paul helped her to become a believer. She was a seller of purple goods because they were experts at dyeing wool and cloth in Thyatira. And one day she went down to the riverside with her friends, and she heard the Apostle Paul talking about Jesus, and she became a believer. So what could Jesus have against these believers? Well, they had other businesses besides dyeing cloth and wool and things like that. They had businesses like potters, bakers, tanners, slave dealers, bronzesmiths. But in these businesses, you couldn't just hold a job on your own or a business on your own. You had to belong to a guild. So a guild's like an association or a club. So like say you were a potter, you had to belong to the Potters Guild. Or maybe you were a tanner, so you had to belong to the Tanners Guild. Or maybe you were a slave dealer, so you had to belong to the Guild of the Slave Dealers. But this put a lot of pressure on the Christians because, if you belonged to a guild, you had to do what they did, and they each had a separate god that they worshipped, and you had to attend the worship feasts of their gods, and you had to do things that were wicked and displeasing to God. Because if you didn't participate in those things, you could lose your job. You could risk losing your job. Many of the believers were doing these things. And the leaders in the church knew it, but they didn't say anything. They didn't say, this is something that we should pray about, or this is something that is serious and you shouldn't be doing these things. They just didn't say anything. But that wasn't the worst thing. Jesus said, you have a woman among you called Jezebel. Now that wasn't her real name, but Jesus called her that because she was like Jezebel in the Old Testament, very wicked. And she was teaching the people to do things that were totally against what God says is right. She taught them to worship idols. She taught them to worship Satan. And the leaders in the church didn't do anything about her. They just let her. And Jesus threatened serious judgment against them if they did not get rid of her and turn away from her teaching. He said, you need to hold fast to my teaching. And he gave the believers a promise, the ones who weren't following after her. He said this, he said, to those that remain faithful and loyal to me, I have a great reward for you. Resist the temptation to follow the teachings of Jezebel. Hold fast to my teaching. What would you do? What would you choose to do? God's ways are always the best ways, and he rewards us for following after him. All right, next week we are going to look at the last 3 churches of the 7. There is Sardis, there's Philadelphia, and there's Laodicea. But only one of them Jesus has nothing bad to say about. So we'll see which one it is next time. We'll see you then.